criminals meet criminals. Money laundering can actually be a really good risk reward sort of setup. Look, the thing we can really, really make money from, if we want to make billions here, is we need to get spare Boeing parts. You now have these more modern types of networks, which are much more rootless and stateless and can be based in different parts of the world. And that's the sort of stuff which wasn't happening 20 years ago. You get these very bizarre connections now, between, for example, Hell's Angels and Iranian spies. You just find a guy and you say, look, I will pay you X to get me Y. There really were cases where people were just ordering, as you say, murders like you would order a pizza. It's not smart if you're a criminal to murder people. It's extremely bad for business. The moment you start killing people and, hiring hitmen and having shootouts and stuff like that, law enforcement, the state has to focus on you.
You've had such an interesting career, seemingly from the outside so far, man. Like investigative reporter with the Financial Times in London, some of the stories you've written about Russian mercenaries, VIP casino heists. I don't even know what Mayfair is. Is that a brand of casino or a type of, what is a Mayfair casino heist?
Yeah, so that might not travel so well. Mayfair is a sort of ultra fancy sort of luxury area in the center of London. It's always historically been the place where sort of money sort of arrives, and it's just a sort of area where you get all these different characters. So yeah, lots of rich people and of all different types, but lots of intrigue. So it's always an interesting place.
Yeah, that checks out. I guess that tracks. And money laundering by the Italian mafia, Vatican financial scandals, covert sanctions busting. So there's a lot we can talk about in the book, which we'll link in the show notes. And by the way, listeners, if you buy the book using our links, it helps support the show, yada, yada. The book focuses initially on how the DEA got its jurisdiction expanded to terrorism and financing, which I know that sounds like super in the weeds, but I was quite interesting. I didn't realize the DEA was sort of a hybrid, from the outside looking in, hybrid law enforcement agency plus intelligence agency kind of feel to it. You think of them as just like, oh, there's the drug FBI, but it's like, well, they're kind of like the drug CIA in a way.
Yeah, so it was sort of a really interesting period of history to look at, because although it's not that long ago, it's sort of post 9/11, and the DEA has been around, for obviously a while, but obviously everything changed post 9/11. There was a lot of pressure to sort of join up the different US agencies and questions about why things were missed, and it basically led to this sort of, through historical accident in a way, what is kind of seems now like this kind of completely audacious experiment in law enforcement, where they sort of said to the DEA, due to various US statute changes, like, pretty much you can almost, not entirely, but almost go after anyone you want in the world. And so you suddenly had these guys who had grown up as drug cops on big streets of big American cities, suddenly going after arms dealers and terror suspects and people all around the world doing these crazy sting operations. And so it was a sort of fascinating way into sort of what then later happened, because they got mixed up in all of these quite interesting investigations.
Yeah, they swing pretty hard. I didn't expect drug cops, like we're sort of calling them, which is not exactly the story, but I didn't expect drug cops to be chasing, for example, Syrian arms dealers. Can you make that connection for us? Because it's like, well, wait a minute. This is an arms dealer. Why are you chasing an arms dealer? You're supposed to be going after a heroin trafficker in Maryland. What are you doing?
Yeah, so there's a sort of technical reason in US law about how you can sort of how links to foreign terror organizations and drugs trafficking, but more sort of generally, it basically was a situation where they had a huge amount of sources. The difference between the DEA and other sort of agencies is that they have this huge sort of foreign source network of criminals. Other agencies also will have that, but they kind of get into places which other people aren't really paying that much attention to. So, it would be some sort of money launderer in West Africa who's working with cocaine traffickers, and they have a sort of undercover agent, and he'll say, by the way, I can also sell you some missile launchers if you want, or something like that. And they're like, oh, how's that? And they'll be like, oh, I know a guy. He's in the Czech Republic, and he can hook me up. And it sort of leads through these various stages into higher and higher levels of these sort of international criminal conspiracies. So they get into things like that, and they just have this sort of different view of the world, which did lead to a lot of clashes, because people were like, what are you guys doing? Why are you getting involved in this stuff? It has frequently was a question for them.
That makes sense, and I get that another agency might be like, hey, what's the deal? We're the arms trafficking people. But at the same time, what are you supposed to do if you're going after 3 tons of cocaine and someone's like, by the way, you want some RPGs? Are you supposed to be like, well, now that you've brought that up, I have to switch you over to my partner who's definitely not an undercover agent at a different agency that has jurisdiction around these things. Nice knowing you. He'll be picking it up from here. I mean, it's like, what are you going to do? Right? You have to act like a criminal, and you can't just... It would seem foolish not to pick up that thread. Like, we could either put him away for 50 years for arms trafficking, or we can just stick with the original idea that we had and get him for drugs only, or we can like get the whole thing and package it together. So I get where they're coming from. I mean, the point is to get rid of these guys, not to get a trophy for doing it, right?
And also, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a sort of different philosophy in a way where, an intelligence agency isn't trying to build criminal cases. They're not trying to build a case that can stand up in front of a judge. And so it's a sort of different approach. And, that means that, it was just this particular time and place where post 9/11, there was a lot of money going into the DEA, and they started to do these, now some of them quite famous sting operations, like Victor Boot, the Russian arms dealer who recently was swapped for Brittany Griner, if you remember that. He was caught in a big famous DEA sting operation in a hotel in Thailand, and that did shock people at the time. When that happened, people were like, what just happened? How did these guys do that? And I think it definitely built from there. So it's this interesting backdrop to where we are now in the world, because, I think people now are more accustomed to the sort of interconnectedness and chaos of the world as it is right now, with all of these different governments hooking up, and people doing business with each other, and the kind of interplay between parts of the shadow economy and governments, and sanctioned governments and stuff. But back then, I think there was much more of a focus on terror, but by getting into those networks is sort of a prelude to kind of the world where we see it now.
How did they get Victor Boot then? Was he also selling drugs along with it? Because that guy's an arms dealer, right? I know they call him the Merchant of Death, but that's like so unoriginal. This guy sells arms sort of famously, right, to bad guys like Syria or maybe North Korea, whatever. I don't know. He just doesn't care. Sort of like African strongmen. I was looking this guy up earlier, and I was like, this is a guy with just no moral compass whatsoever. He just doesn't care that they're going to slaughter civilians with this stuff. Like it's really like he knows it and just doesn't care. But was he also selling drugs? Is that how they got him?
No, he was dealing with people who were connected to selling drugs. And so under the sort of statutes that came in, if you are transacting with someone who is basically getting money from trafficking drugs, for example, a Latin American paramilitary group or something like that who might want to buy arms, then that comes under sort of US jurisdiction. And that sort of opened up a lot of cases. Also, there are these these sting operations where they would pose, they're very controversial. They would pose as members of FARC, for example, the Colombian paramilitary, and go down a whole sort of business arrangement, and that's how they got other people like Mons Alcazar, the sort of Prince of Marbella, he was called. But yeah, these were sort of these very aggressive law enforcement operations, which really kind of surprised people. And yeah, I mean, we'll come to how things are now, but that was definitely a period of time, which I think at the time people didn't realize was going to be. It wasn't going to last forever, put it that way.
You mentioned that they use, I think in the book you said criminal impersonators or something, but that's just like an undercover agent posing as FARC or Hezbollah. And yeah, this fascinating stuff. I mean, that's a totally crazy position to be in. Imagine being like, well, I'm DEA, but I'm going to pretend I'm in Hezbollah and like go to a meeting in Syria or Lebanon or whatever, I don't even know, and meet with these people. It's just super high stakes. Tell me about, they did, you mentioned a name earlier that I didn't quite catch, but there's another guy in the book, Ali Fayyad. Who is?
Oh
How did they
yes,
get
yeah.
this guy? This is pretty interesting. This
Yeah,
bust.
so he was a pretty fascinating character. He was because of what both who he was, who he was working with, and also sort of what happened after they got him. But he was a Lebanese born arms trafficker who was living in Ukraine. So basically, he was actually an advisor to Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president who was deposed. Basically, if we're flashing back, back to he was the Russia-aligned president who was sort of deposed and had to flee to Russia during the color revolution there. So he basically just after that ended up getting caught in this DEA sting where he was offering to sell Igla missile launchers to Colombian paramilitaries, and it was in Prague. And so they kind of, in combination with Czech police, they sort of have to set up this whole deal. They get really nervous about, because people in the DEA were concerned that that Fayyad had access to Interpol somehow. He had someone on the inside. Obviously Interpol information spreads around lots of different countries, and they were always paranoid that maybe it might leak, that they were doing an operation there, and then they're worried he's going to be put on a no-fly list. And eventually he gets there. It's a sort of like classic thing with a hotel room which is all wired up with cameras and microphones and stuff, and they arrest him. And then he's awaiting extradition. And so he's in the Czech Republic awaiting extradition to the United States. And then a group of Czech citizens, one of which was his lawyer, and another one was the lawyer's translator. They were on a trip to Lebanon, and then they get kidnapped. So suddenly there's this situation where these unknown kidnappers, at the time no one knew who they were basically saying, if you don't give us back Fayyad, these guys aren't coming home.
Wow.
So it became suddenly a kind of international incident. And frequently that was there were a lot of unintended or unknowable consequences from these sorts of dramatic operations.
Gosh, these guys really are sort of fearless if they're going to go ahead and kidnap people in the, I guess, host country and say, yeah, we're just going to kill these journalists or whatever if you don't release this clearly guilty terrorist. I mean, they just don't care. It's sort of shocking, but it also shows you what we're dealing with as a civilization, right? We're just dealing with people who don't care. What's up with arms dealers in the Czech Republic? I feel like either it's a coincidence that none of those guys seem to be there. Is it just because it's sort of between the Eastern Bloc and Western Europe? Is it just geography, or is it like, does the Czech Republic have something to do? I know they manufacture some weapons there, but that you wouldn't think that'd be a requirement here in 2024 to be next to the factory.
I think it's for historical reasons, as you say, sort of an indigenous industry there, and stockpiles potentially of obviously the sort of post after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were lots of stockpiles of kind of now redundant or unused munitions, so there's that sort of stuff too. But yeah, it is interesting. There was obviously the famous incident of there was a factory which sort of mysteriously caught fire there, wasn't it, which was linked to later to Russian intelligence. There seems to be like a lot of arms
I didn't hear about that
going on there.
So they just lit the factory on fire? Why were they supplying Ukraine or something like that?
I think, I can't remember the exact details. There's been some good work on it by various outlets. I think Bellingcat as well. But I think it might have been that they were shipping. It was a man who was shipping weapons to Georgia, I think. But don't hold me to that.
Okay.
But yeah, so it's just this very interesting. It's this sort of weird world where you have these people who are acting, effectively, no one knows exactly who they're working for. In the case, we mentioned about Fayyad, that was an interesting case where he was clearly important enough for 5 people to be kidnapped to get him released. It's sort of, if I get kidnapped, I don't think that's going to happen. It's like the average person
unlikely.
doesn't get that, that sort of insurance policy. So, but there is this sort of world, which these sort of DEA operations tapped into, of these, they're effectively sort of procurement agents. They're doing lots of different things at the same time. They're working sometimes with governments. Sometimes they're working under some sort of diplomatic cover. Some of them are sort of honorary councils. for countries, and so they have sort of diplomatic passports, and they can facilitate various things. They can move money around for people. They can procure weapons. They're sort of complex and difficult to pin down because they don't really fit into the classic category of a sort of gangster, and they're weird facilitation agents, sort of
Yeah.
shadowy figures.
I have to say, and I know that this sounds a little bit horrible, but that's just got to be such an interesting career to have. I know that these are bad guys and whatnot, but I just think, man, what a fascinating lifestyle to procure weapons for whoever and have a diplomatic passport, and you're like the agricultural attaché for Zambia or in Zambia or whatever, and you're just like, yeah, I'm having meetings all the time, and what you're really doing is just doing crazy international intrigue. I mean, it's just, morality aside, it's just got to be such a weird lifestyle. I mean, who are your colleagues? Who do you talk to about a hard day at work? Nobody. Right? No one can. You can't lean on anyone for this. It seems like.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's some sort of secret, ultra
Yeah.
encrypted online support group for them or something.
Yeah, it's a hell of a Discord server they got going. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, there's some of these characters are, that they are involved in terrible things, but I've spoken to sources and friends of mine who've dealt with these people who will say, they're bad guys, but they are very interesting people. They are very intelligent. They're sort of talented. They've turned their talents to a terrible thing, but they're clearly extremely able people, and sort of just organizing pretty complicated things,
Yeah.
arranging for shipments to move around the world and stuff like that. It's not without getting caught,
Right.
it's not easy.
Yeah, and also one of your parties speaks French, the other speaks Lebanese Arabic. This other guy over here only speaks an African dialect of English and some, local stuff. And you just have to sort of be fluent enough in all of those to make sure that nothing gets lost in the translation and everything runs smoothly. And you got to do it without using a bank, right, or anything. And it's just like unbelievable. You'd think it would be high tech, and we'll get to this in a minute, but it's actually quite low tech, right? You think like, oh, it's going to be Bitcoin and this and that and the no, it's more like, well, we'll get to it in a minute. I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Tell me how foreign governments and terror organizations like Hezbollah, who has been in the news recently, how do they use drug trafficking to buy weapons and launder money and stuff like this? 'Cause, first of all, I thought they got funding from Iran. So why do they need to do this at all anyway?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I mean, if you step back, when you're a sanctioned government or you're a sanctioned sort of non-state actor, like a sort of Hezbollah is, you obviously just by inherently can't just buy stuff. You can't use the banking system. You can't procure the things you need, especially if you're sort of, involved in sort of military activity. Let's say you want to buy night vision goggles, and, the night vision goggles you can get from China are crap. And so you want to get the night vision goggles from the United States, and you need to figure out a way to get those. So you have to sort of just immediately, you have to start engaging in this sort of global shadow economy where you have to find these people like these facilitation agents, who can do stuff for you. They might not be in any way ideologically motivated. It might just be purely business. You just basically, you just find a guy and you say, look, I'll pay you X to get me Y. In terms of the sort of specific financing, it's like there are, these are complex organizations where they're often portrayed as being extremely hierarchical and sort of tightly controlled and disciplined. But of course, there are sort of a multitude of sort of people in them and actions and different reasons for why people would start to engage in things connected with drug trafficking. So, a more recent example would be, which has got more attention recently, is the Syrian government's involvement in Captagon trading, which is an amphetamine. And it's like manufactured at absolutely mass, like industrial scale by the Syrian government. And, the whole bunch of people were sanctioned. And it goes up to the very top, like the US and the UK last year sanctioned a guy who was Bashar al-Assad, his cousin, So it's really like the inner circle who are involved in this stuff, and it's also connected to Hezbollah connected figures, and has to be sort of moved. And this stuff ends up, there was a massive seizure in port Salerno in Naples. It was like 1 billion pills, in 2020. And in that sanctions note last year, they said that the Syrian Captagon trade, I don't know how they quantify this, but the UK said that it was bigger than all of the Mexican cartels combined. So basically, you have a situation where, and obviously, so you have this situation where in that region, you have people financing themselves through drugs because they have to, in a way, because, if you don't have access to the international, that's not to excuse it, by the way, but I'm saying, like, if you don't have access to the banking system, and you can't sort of transfer money around very easily, and you need to raise revenues for expensive things, especially in the context of the book. It was during the Syrian civil war when Hezbollah got involved in a very, very different type of conflict than it was used to, which was extremely expensive. And so, it was very interesting around the time of the Syrian civil war. A lot of these DEA investigations were picking up these sorts of weird cells of people, who were basically kind of piggybacking off the explosion in the European cocaine trade, because they could basically, there's a huge amount of dirty money washing up in Europe, and they can kind of launder it through Middle Eastern banks and then take a cut and make money that way. And then they were serving various purposes. So, one of these cells, which was in a really big DEA operation in 2016 in Paris, it was doing the drug money laundering. It was calling in on a daily basis to one of the most top Hezbollah financiers, a guy who's currently got a $10 million reward on his head from the US government. So they're calling in, reporting in, laundering all this cocaine drug money, and also procuring loads of weapons from Russia and Belarus. So they're sort of doing all of these things at the same time. So, so the reason why would be, simply to raise funds, and circumvent sanctions. That's sort of a prime driver for that. But there's also other issues in any organization. There's corruption, there's people kind of skimming off money, or there are people acting more autonomously, and it's that's always hard to sort of discern from the outside.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, the whole thing is so opaque, hence the title of your book. I actually did a whole episode on Captagon, episode 864. This woman, Caroline Rose, who you may know, she's the one who I think is in part in charge of quantifying a lot of this stuff, because that's her area of research. And I remember vaguely, and so don't call me on this, but I think I said, how do you do this? And one of the things she did was look at the capacities of the factories that they kind of know make it. And they just go, well, there's at least that much. And it's just this huge amount, because imagine if every Pfizer manufacturing plant in America was making methamphetamine. That adds up fast. And Syria is smaller than America, but Syria's got their domestic pharmaceutical trade, which it was, I guess, pretty good at before it all fell apart. And they were just instead of making this knockoff Tylenol for babies, let's just make Captagon and sell it to the Gulf region. And they just did that with every factory that's basically still standing. And then that money goes to Bashar al-Assad's government so that he can murder his own people, basically. And it's funny you mentioned night vision goggles and Hezbollah, because back in the 90s, I've told this on this show before, I think, back in the 90s, my daddy worked at Ford in Detroit, and we have a huge, huge, huge Lebanese population in Detroit. And I think we actually, at one point, maybe not still, had the largest population of Arabs outside the Middle East in Dearborn, Michigan. And so, and we have tons of great Lebanese food, Arabic food, tons of people live in your neighborhood, tons of people work at Ford and GM and all that stuff from Lebanon. But one day, my dad was like, oh, what's going on? And the FBI was in his office taking out this dude's computer that he worked with, asking everybody questions. And he's like, that guy, this nice Lebanese dude, he was, just kind of working here 1 or 2 years. They're like, yeah, he's been buying night vision goggles, military surplus or whatever, night vision, and shipping them to Lebanon. And my dad's like, oh, is that illegal? And they're like, it is when they're being sent to Hezbollah, which is what he was doing. So he was just working at Ford, but part-time, either a procurement guy or a sympathizer at the very least of Hezbollah. And he was spending thousands and thousands of dollars. And he was using his work computer to do it because he was just not the brightest bulb in the box, I guess. and using the internet to do it. And they're like, okay, well, we don't really need to ask. We don't need to dig too far to find this because all this network traffic is obviously monitored by Ford's IT department. So here he is talking unencrypted with like, night vision suppliers and mailing it to Lebanon. And my dad didn't fully understand why. But now that I'm an adult, I get that he was essentially trying to get around sanctions because Hezbollah can't just order those things to Lebanon themselves. They have to have third parties.
And you see this, this is a big thing now, especially post, the invasion of Ukraine, with Russia, where, Russia's obviously now under, has overtaken Iran as the most sanctioned government in the world. And, to get the components, Western-made components it needs to find people to get them. So it needs to get, American-made microchips, to put into, precision-guided missiles. And it has to get all of these types of industrial equipment, which are all sanctioned. And so it has to, there are various, there's been all these other cases now of sort of these sorts of procurement cells for Russia trying to procure that stuff. And it's just sort of a cycle. And eventually, in the case of Iran, they figure out how to build this stuff themselves. They'll get an example of something and reverse engineer, how an engine works. There's this thing with Bell helicopters. I think there was some historical reason dating back to the Shah of Iran where they had a whole bunch of Bell helicopters, and post the revolution, they've just always used these kind of imitations of Bell helicopters. But some of these cases involve people, trying to fly 10, a ton of coke on a private plane from the Dominican Republic to Belgium, whilst also at the same time trying to procure Bell helicopter parts. It's sort of these quite it's a strange world where people are sort of wearing multiple hats.
It'd be like cracking open an Amazon van where you're like, oh, batteries, a spare remote for some sort of or controller for a video game system, DVDs. Like it's just it's like whatever y'all need, and you must be able to tell when you bust somebody who they're working for, because it's like you get caught with a bunch of cocaine, it's like, oh, he's a drug dealer. But then when he's caught with a bunch of cocaine in like some weird turbine for a Boeing 747, you're just like, okay, we need to call this up a couple of levels, because normal people don't buy $30,000 fans made out of titanium or whatever. That's just not a thing.
Yeah, I mean, look, there was a really interesting thing is in the podcast that I recently did, the Hot Money, the New Narcos. There's this episode, which no spoilers, but it involves a sort of one of these kind of procurement agents who's really interesting. She's a Lebanese woman who is caught in a sting operation in New York. And the thing which I found really interesting about looking through that case is that she's doing multiple things. She's saying, okay, you need to launder your cocaine money. The undercover agent is basically, he's a DEA undercover who's posing as a big time Latin American trafficker. And she's like, okay, any money you need to launder, I can do that. But can you do me a favor? I need some weapons. I really need to get hold of some all these sniper rifles and all this stuff. And, he's like, of course, whatever you need, I can get this and stuff like that. But the really interesting thing about that is that near the end of the conversation, she's like, look, the thing we can really, really make money from, if we want to make billions here, is we need to get spare Boeing parts. That's the thing that we'll make tons of cash from. More than the drug money, more than the weapons. If we really want to get rich, Boeing parts. And that's just sort of like insight into, I think, how the economics of this work, where you have these choke points. You can't, if you're a sanctioned government, it's very difficult to get. You can't just buy a kind of imitation Boeing part. You have to have the real deal.
You probably don't want to buy an imitation part for an airliner that you're going to fly in your own country with your own people.
Exactly. So it's just sort of, it definitely, it's exactly as you say, it's a kind of a little bit like some sort of Amazon van where people are doing, and criminals meet criminals. People in weird worlds meet weird they meet other people. That's frequently how law enforcement DEA were doing these operations, and they'd sort of move up the chain, that someone would introduce someone to someone else, and eventually before you know it, you're in a situation where you're talking to an arms dealer in Prague or whatever.
Yeah, this gal that you're just talking about, she was quite interesting, and the DEA guy, Angel or whatever his pretend name was, that guy was really interesting. That was such an interesting guy.
Yeah, fantastic guy. Yeah,
just a talented dude. And it must be pretty damn exciting when you're having a conversation about sniper rifles, and then somebody just drops in, oh, and by the way, and you're like, oh, this person is essentially working for Iran or Hezbollah. Like that's, you first you think you're talking to like a medium arms dealer who's going to just, you're like, oh, this is a crime. She's going to get 5 years for being oh, wait a minute. Nope. We're into the intelligence world. Now we're into, it must just be hard to hide the grin that's happening inside your brain when somebody brings up something like this, over dessert. And you're just like, oh, this went from 5 years to 25 years prison sentence for this person.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Angel says in the podcast. He says, he couldn't help. He knew that there were cameras on him in this restaurant, and he couldn't help but sort of smile to the camera, to sort of give a little signal to himself, which I thought was like, is she not going to see that? But, it seems to
he
work
could just
out
say,
fine.
I like the sound of getting rich. That's what I would have done. I love the sound of this. I like getting rich, and then she's like, great, cheers. And you're just thinking, oh, you're going to be so mad when you find out who I really am. Yeah, that's
absolutely.
And she pled guilty. She went to prison. And what I don't get, man, and I'm sure you're in the same boat, is she gets released later, and then of course she vanishes. And I'm like, how do we let these people out? I mean, I know she served time in prison, but it's just it sucks because what happens is when, like, if Iran doesn't like us, they arrest some baker who's on vacation in visiting grandma in Iran who hasn't done anything, and we're arresting arms dealers and letting them out after they've served their sentence. And I know that's like democratic values versus authoritarian, crappy, what's the word? Theocratic regimes. But I don't know. It's unfair, right? It's unfair. That's all there is to it.
Well, I mean, adjacent to that is sort of, I speak to a lot of people in law enforcement, in the US and Europe. And, one of the unifying themes of what they say, especially more in Europe, is that money laundering can actually be a really good risk reward sort of setup, because you don't, if you traffic, I don't know, call it 20 million euros worth of cocaine, you get caught, you're going to jail for a very long time. In any jurisdiction. If you launder the proceeds of 20 million euros worth of cocaine, you might do 3 years, 4 years. If you're taking, if you're taking, typically you could be taking anything up to 20%, a 20% cut of that to launder the money, to transfer the money from one place to another. So it means that some of the people involved in these worlds, especially if they're caught on money laundering charges, actually get very low sentences in relation to the sort of stuff they're actually involved in. And that's just this sort of, I don't know why exactly that is. I think it must relate to a sort of typically a view of money laundering as not being a sort of, not a victimless crime, but very different to sort of drugs trafficking.
Right. It kind of looks like tax evasion as opposed to like, well, this is a violent criminal. And it's like, well, okay, but the money they're laundering goes to people who are using it to buy bombs and blow up people at shopping malls in another place. So that's not really the case anymore. And yeah, it's crazy to think about. If you laundered $20 million and you get 20% and you get a short sentence, you could be making $1 million a year sitting in prison reading. And then you get out and you're just like that. It's like you just did 4 years of work that a job other people would kill to have that salary, right? And you've spent your time just catching up on books and Netflix or whatever in your Belgian prison. It's just, it's again back to the unfair thing. Hezbollah in Syria, you mentioned that they were in a very expensive conflict. So Hezbollah is in Syria, and this is going on now, I think, protecting Bashar al-Assad, so the dictator of Syria. So Hezbollah is in Lebanon, they're a proxy of Iran, and they're protecting a dictator in Syria. Why? What's happening there?
I mean, in the simplest sense, I mean, obviously that Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite, so he's sort of a Shiite, but most importantly, you need, if Syria were to fall and to be replaced, the Assad regime was to be replaced by some new government, which was potentially allied with the West or was hostile to Iran, you're sort of cutting off the bridge between Iran and Lebanon and Hezbollah. So that's like really, really strategically important. It's sort of that's a sort of existential issue effectively. Okay. So that's really the driving factor there. I mean, of course, that's not the stated aim, there would be other reasons, for it was very much stated as they were fighting Sunni extremists or Salafis, people like ISIS, and they was basically protecting Shiites in Syria. But at the end of the day, Syria is really strategically important for a number of countries. That's why that civil war was just so, obviously the human cost was horrific, and it was just an extremely complex sort of multipolar conflict with all of these different countries having a sort of stake in it.
It sort of sounds like Bosnia in complexity, right? There's all these different sub-militias fighting, and then everyone around them is like, well, we kind of want this side to win, so we're going to arm these dudes. And then external forces come in and arm other people and set up, and then every neighbor is like, well, I don't want this spilling over my border, so I'm going to start striking the side that's getting close to me or has it out for me, like Turkey, Russia. You've got different Iranian militias in there. You got ISIS in there. The Syrian government's in there. The U.S. has some troops nearby there training other troops and forces. It's a huge mess. I know that that's not over, but is it essentially sort of a win for al-Assad at this point?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, he is in place. He is, there's still pockets of the country which are under his control, but that conflict is effectively, over in that sense. And, that's why, in the current situation we're in now, Iran, it wasn't always a sure thing by any means. There's sort of, I spoke to a lot of experts and academics about the conflict, which is unbelievably complex. And, I think it's interesting to look at the way the historiography has developed in terms of seeing how there was a narrative at the time, at some points where it's like almost like he's going to fall and it's inevitable. And now there are some scholars who sort of that said that he wasn't ever really that much in risk. But, depends on your interpretation. But now, yeah, he is very much there. And as you said, they're now he's sort of to a certain extent been rehabilitated in some quarters, sort of being reaccepted into the Arab League, and people, it's awful, but people's attention has moved to elsewhere.
Yeah. Wow. It's. I want to point out that it is very interesting that Hezbollah loves to argue that they are very principled and they're defending the Islam and Arabs against Israel, but they were more than happy to go kill Muslim children in Syria to protect a dictator that is also murdering his own population. They didn't have any qualms throwing all of their resources at that particular cause.
Well, that was controversial to say the least. It was an unpopular choice. As you say, it's
Really?
difficult to justify. There were critics. I mean, there were some people who were very vocal in their criticism who would even. I mean, it was obviously it's a much more difficult expedition to justify than fighting Israel, for example. So, but I guess in the end, all of these. I think. Every organization, wherever it is, these sorts of, paramilitary style organizations, terrorist groups, they sort of, they evolve, they change, they get involved in things which, just like the militants themselves, people, I think we have a tendency to view people as sort of static in their lives. And I think people's reasons for doing things change. They might be doing the same thing, but the reason for them doing it changes over their life, and both of the lifetime of organization and also the lifetime of someone in that organization. People might do things when they're 20 with sort of ideological fervor, and then for when they're 40, just kind of still be involved, but doing it for a very different reason. It might be for personal enrichment or just self-protection or just raw politics. I think that evolution of these types of organizations is always difficult to capture and easy to overlook. We have a tendency to view them as sort of static.
That's a good point.
Static entities.
Yeah, that is a good point. I mean, if you look at dictators like Fidel Castro, right, so like this revolutionary, and then you look and you're like, no, this guy is just an oligarch, or chief oligarch of Cuba at this point. But he wasn't always like that. I'm sure if you caught him when he was 19 years old, he would have talked your ear off about communist revolution and making everybody equal, and then it's just like, that's not going to work. But I can have a Rolls Royce. Thanks for watching on YouTube. Remember, you can also enjoy the Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Our podcast feed is a treasure trove of insights from intellectuals, authors, spies, artists, athletes, pioneers, engineers, former mafia bosses, and business leaders, all sharing their secrets to success. For more information, click the link in the description. Now, back to the show. Tell me about the super facilitators and this car scheme, about how they're kind of laundering money, moving cars around. This is, I think, Hezbollah drug finance in Europe. I know I'm skipping around, but I warned you.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just another example of one of these schemes. Is that as you sort of you touched on earlier, there is this sort of assumption, I think, amongst a lot of people, and I also had this assumption before I started looking at this in more detail, that money laundering is high tech in some way, and actually a lot of money laundering schemes involve sort of fairly, kind of complex in their logistics, but effectively simple mechanisms of transferring value from one place to another in the world. And usually by transforming, one technique is transforming cash into something else, shipping it somewhere, and then transforming it back into cash. And so a really good way to do that, and this was a scheme that the DEA got very involved in sort of investigating back around, I think it was sort of around 2008, 2009, and eventually actually led to like a pretty big settlement with a Lebanese bank, which was sort of taking a lot of this money in. But it was buying up cars in cash in the United States, shipping them to West Africa, and then sort of selling them in West Africa. So you'd have these car lots, you have like satellite images of these car lots, which are just empty spaces. And then within sort of a couple of years, they're just millions, I mean, maybe not millions, but really thousands and thousands of cars, as far as I could see. And that was a way of transferring this value, it's a very effective way to move large amounts of money in a way which you just could not do if you were trying to sort of send that through the banking system. Like the moment you were trying to put that into an account, it would be flagged. So it was a pretty simple but effective scheme.
You think, though, man, it's got to sting a little bit because you lose so much value if you're buying a bunch of new cars and then you're just parking them. I mean, immediately, like the cliche is you drive it off the lot and it loses some double-digit percentage of its value. And if you're doing that times tens of thousands, and then you don't necessarily have anywhere to put the car, right, to sell the car, to turn it back into cash, it's like, oh, man. But I guess if you're selling drugs, the markup is fine and you don't care and the margins are huge.
And it's leakage, I think you accept when you're trying to launder money, you accept it's going to cost you 10%, 20%, sometimes even more, depending on the jurisdiction. I found, like, diving into this stuff, one of the things I found interesting was you look at these money launderers and they have different rates for different countries. So in Europe, they'll say like, oh, in Germany, yeah, sure, I'll charge you whatever, 5%, because it's easy to work in Germany. In Germany, there's a lot of use of cash still. But in France is difficult. France, I'm going to charge you 15 or 20%. There's various different, so it's a criminal market rate, sort of, which is set by the market just on sort of basically general perceptions amongst this group of people who are engaged in that, of how risky and how difficult it is. And I found that really interesting. But I mean, one of the things which, so we learned, for example, during the podcast was that, the price is going, the rate which is being charged is going down. So,
really?
In Europe,
Why?
as in, that's a really, but why would that be? It's a really interesting question. And, these people who work in law enforcement, they say, because now there's so much drugs money in Europe that basically there's so much demand that people have to, basically people are laundering a lot more. The capacity of these laundering networks has gone up, and there's sort of new entrants into the market, and they sort of buy market share. It's like any other service, they sort of like, introductory offer, I'll launder your money to, I don't know, Dubai for 1% this time instead of the normal 5 or something like that. And so it sort of shows something else about what's going on in the sort of criminal kind of economy through just like the rate which is being charged. But the cars, that was an important scheme, but there's sort of since, more and more, it's just sort of in this, it has this sort of nature of it where people are extremely innovative. It's they come up with new ruses and new schemes to sort of launder money all the time. You know, there's always some new things. There's a constantly evolving marketplace, and it's just sort of, it's not something which is traditionally viewed through the lens of, you know, sort of business school studies or something, you know, in terms of the way people are running these operations. But again, it's not to celebrate it, but it's just an interesting parallel sort of economy where people are trying to innovate, just like anywhere else.
Yeah, shadow economy. I did an episode several years ago, episode 677, with this journalist Sam Cooper, who talks about Chinese buying real estate in Canada and moving money around and stuff like that. And he mentioned often that the cash doesn't have to move because you'll have somebody in one country who essentially says, okay, let me call my cousin who owns a laundromat over in Vancouver. And the cousin's like, yeah, I've got $3 million laying on the floor of my laundromat right now that somebody brought over in like several duffel bags, you know, or a van or whatever. And then the cousin's like, okay, great. All right, I'll release this $3 million to you, your family here in China, less 5% for our fee. And so the cash, because I was like, how are they moving vans and truckloads literally of $100 bills from China to the U.S. or from Syria to Canada? I mean, who knows? And the answer is they just don't have to. They have these sort of really low tech, trust-based systems. So there's one called Hawala. Do you know anything about this? It's like an Arabic sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a really, I mean, yeah, that's a really, really important Hawala or Hawala kind of like systems, exactly as you describe, where the cash doesn't actually have to physically move. Really critical part of how this all sort of functions. And for me, I found that really hard to get my head around at first. Just as you're saying it, you're like, how does that work? What do you mean you're saying the money doesn't move? And then yeah, that's a critical part of drug money laundering around the world, you know, because then it's effectively, yeah, it's like this sort of informal banking system where there are kind of corresponding trades, you know, in the same way in sort of a clearinghouse, like a financial clearinghouse, you would net off trades. You know, it's like someone wants to sort of you know, do one thing on one side of the network, and then that corresponds with a customer on the other side of the network who wants to do the opposite thing, and so they can kind of deposit money or take out money, and it means that, you know, it doesn't actually have to move. And that makes it really, really, really difficult to trace the money.
Yeah.
You know, you can't, there's no transaction records. Like you can't, you know, there'll be a ledger probably somewhere. But, you know, it's extremely difficult for law enforcement. Once the money goes into that system, you know, it's could come out anywhere. It's gone.
Yeah. Wow. It's so interesting because, again, I know, like, money laundering. All right, we're going to use this cryptocurrency. We're going to use Monero. It's untraceable. It's encrypted, yada, yada. And then we're going to move it to these. No, we're going to use something that existed before banks existed, before ACH, well before electronic transfer, before there was any sort of bank that was used by anybody but the King of England or whatever. We were transferring money for centuries by scratching it into, I don't know, papyrus with a reed, and that means that this guy has like 3 shekels on account here, and he can spend them however he wants. It's just, but you can do that now with probably tens of millions of dollars relatively safely and reliably, which just is yeah, it's like mind blowing. I would never trust that. It's like, oh, so I send your cousin this money, and I'm never going to see it again, and you just promise me that it's all good, and you're in another country. I mean, that's it.
They have various sort of, you know, trust based, you know, even just dropping off the money, because, you know, there'll be a network of couriers, you know, so, you know, it's like the guy who's really running the network isn't touching the money so much. You know, there'll be a sort of people who go to collect the money. So, you know, someone will call up, and frequently, you know, in the European cocaine trade, for example, a cartel will have their money launderer in place in Europe, and their buyer will then just be say, like, call this number. Then they'll be like, hi, you know, they'll give a fake name and they'll say, meet me here, and you have to drop, you know, a pretty large amount of cash with them. And so just to trust in that situation, they frequently have systems of, you know, they'll have a banknote, and they'll have the serial number of the banknote, and they'll give that in advance, and you have to basically provide that serial number to show you're the actual person.
Oh, wow.
It's that's a really frequently used system to sort of as some sort of guarantee. But it's this interesting sort of paradox where these networks are sort of facilitated by technology in a way where, like, now in the modern age, you can do stuff as a crime boss, which you definitely couldn't do 30 years ago. You know, traditionally, you know, criminal organizations are rooted in like a territory, like a home turf, you know,
Sicily or whatever.
Yeah, and that's all what gives them their strength. But you now have these more modern types of networks which are much more rootless and stateless and can be based in different parts of the world, and you can, because of like encrypted communications and smartphones and stuff, you can run stuff with this technology. But paradoxically, the stuff which enables them to get really big and do stuff which they couldn't do before is a huge weakness, because obviously
Yeah.
you've had in these cases in Europe where they crack into these networks and suddenly see absolutely everything that these guys are doing. So keeping it simple, just moving cash physically or writing notes on a piece of paper and handing them to someone, the lowest tech option becomes the sort of lowest risk way of running these organizations. So yeah, it's
You mentioned the technology, the encrypted phone system. I think it was called EncroChat, and law enforcement ends up breaking this. Honestly, though, it seems like the name gives it away because it let law enforcement encroach on all the criminals' business. And I'm thinking, like, you should have seen that coming, guys. Come on, EncroChat. Am I just missing? Am I missing the cleverness here, or was it just like this was doomed to fail?
I mean, they were pretty shady. These were companies that were advertising to their client base, which obviously were serious organized criminals. And they were very much sort of signaling the only reason why you'd want to use this service if you are a serious organized criminal. So sort of they are basically like telegraphing to the world, like, we are providing a service for these guys. And there's still, they're still unpicking these cases. There's, there were other platforms. There was one called Sky ECC, which was a huge platform in Europe. And just last week, there was this crazy case in the United States relating to this attempted, I don't know if you saw this, there was this Iranian drugs trafficker used one of these encrypted platforms to order a Hell's Angel in Canada to go and murder some Iranian dissidents living in the United States.
Wow.
And this was all just done on these, encrypted networks, and it was done on behest, according to the indictment by the US Department of Justice. It was done on the behest of Iran's intelligence services. So they're sort of using a top drug trafficker in Iran to try to kill people abroad through Hell's Angels using encrypted messaging platforms. That's the sort of stuff which wasn't happening 20 years ago, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
sort
of course.
Pretty wild.
That guy just went from murder for hire to terrorist and is probably going to have a tougher time defending that in court, I'm guessing. Like, I don't think you can say my client didn't know that his clients who'd paid him to murder somebody were foreign agents. I don't think that flies too well in court. I don't know. TBD.
I don't know. Yeah, it's exactly TBD. Yeah, but it's sort of it's this sort of very bizarre. You get these very bizarre connections now. Between for example, Hell's Angels and Iranian spies. Like, why are they talking to each other? It's surreal.
Yeah. It is disturbing that these crime bosses and terrorist organizations can hire an assassin basically like they order a pizza. You mentioned in the I think it was the book of the podcast where it's just like a couple of text messages and somebody's like, who needs to go to sleep? And it's like, here's the guy. We don't know why. We don't care why. Here's what his address is, and here's what you're going to get. And the guy's like, all right, I'll just go kill this person that I know nothing about. That's really disturbing.
It is really disturbing. And I mean, it's something which, I think it got a lot of attention. There were things in the past, in recent past, where, there were sort of online, forums on like the dark
Silk
web or
Road
something
or
where people could
something.
try and, Silk Road, for example, where people could try and order contract killings and stuff like that. But as far as I'm aware, nothing ever really happened.
Right.
That were, whereas in these instances, I mean, this isn't like a public forum where it can be done, but there really were cases where people were just ordering, as you say, murders like you would order a pizza, and from anywhere in the world. And it's sort of, I always thought, potentially that was somewhat of the explanation between this, behind this kind of jump in these sorts of murders in Europe, drug-related murders, because maybe if you're just ordering something on a smartphone, you're not really paying as much attention to it as you normally would, or understanding the severity of what I'm not in any way excusing them again, but maybe it's almost gamified or something. They're just sort of sending messages to people, ordering people to do stuff from thousands of miles away. They feel much more invulnerable.
I think so. And also, look, if you're an old school mafia guy and you want to kill somebody, you have to send like your cousin to go and do it. But now and they're connected to you, and if something happens to them, it's bad, and then people are going to be sad and upset and angry and question you. But now, if you're sending some random biker who you've never met, who can't be traced back to you very easily unless the CIA is watching or the FBI, who cares? Right? Oh, he got shot trying to kill that guy. Fine, whatever. We sent him like 50 grand. That's no skin off our nose, or whatever it was. That's no skin off our nose. Just find another idiot who's going to say yes to the same contract and try again. I don't care. What's for lunch, right? So it's way different. The calculus of like, we might get caught doing this. Tommy might get injured doing this. Mom's going to cry if he gets shot. Like all that is gone. All that's
absolutely. I think that's a really important point. I think it creates plausible deniability in a way which you wouldn't have traditionally. You just wouldn't be able to, and that's for anyone who's using these services. In the case of that Hell's Angel thing, the Iranian state allegedly, or if it's like just other crime bosses, you can do stuff where the downside for you is much lower. Clearly, as you're saying, it's if it can't be traced back to you very easily, and if you don't even know the person who's doing it, so you don't care about them, then the cost goes down. And I think that's played a big role. So it's this sort of there's definitely a sort of technological factor in there, which has sort of accelerated some of these things.
You always hear about the Netherlands being one of the richest and most stable countries in Western Europe or in the world, really. But it now, and this isn't, I guess, just the Netherlands, but it sort of focused on the Rotterdam cocaine trade. Now it seems like there's more and more drugs, and there's more and more violent crime. There's more and more murders and assassinations as drug kingpins basically try to tighten their control of Europe's cocaine market, which again principally flows through the port at Rotterdam. It seems like European law enforcement, and I'm wondering what your take is. It seems like European law enforcement, with like their unarmed cops in many places, are they ill-equipped to handle this level of violence and this threat to stability, or are they adapting well? Because it's like they're just not used to this.
It's a good question. I mean, I think, in an international context, the number of murders in Europe is super low still.
Yeah.
So even in like Holland and stuff, it's more that the style of violence has been very shocking, and some of the things that have happened, for example, the murders of journalists and lawyers, and it's sort of much more of an attack on like civil society, and that's really, really shocking. But in terms of absolute numbers, it's way lower than for example, a large American city, for obvious reasons, things like availability of firearms and stuff like that. But in terms of the response, I think, European law enforcement has had to really, really, really catch up, because there were things happening sort of 4 or 5 years ago which shocked, everyone. I think, stuff your listeners might have heard of, like, for example, the Irish Kinahan cartel, the feud they got engaged in Dublin after there was an attempt on the son, Daniel Kinahan's life. And, this was a sort of feud which went on for years. There were 18 people, I think, were murdered. There were sort of 40 attempts on people's lives, stuff which had never been seen on the streets of a European city, where hitmen were being contracted and flown in from abroad to sort of like take out rivals. That was stuff which meant that, yes, there were elements of the approach that had to change for European law enforcement. And they did make, but it's still, it has been complex. It's been really difficult because, one of the things which is a big factor on this is that a lot of these European crime bosses were not in Europe. So they were in Dubai, for example, and there was not an extradition agreement with Dubai. So you could be ordering your murders on your phone, and then it would take a very long time to sort of solve what actually happened there, especially before they cracked these networks. And you're also in a country where you can't be extradited from. So there was a huge challenge and hurdle for European law enforcement. But I mean, they have made progress. They have got some big people, but there's still people who are big who are out there.
Yeah, I did an episode about this, episode 860, with Mitchell Prothero, who talks about the cocaine trade in Europe. And he mentioned there was one guy, I think he was Albanian or something like that, and he's in a prison, and essentially they have like missiles mounted on top of the prison, because he was like, yeah, I'm going to get a helicopter rescue, and they're going to RPG the roof. And it was normally, if a prisoner says that, it's like, hey, shut up and eat your breakfast. But they're like, oh, this guy actually is kind of credible. Like, he could pull off having a helicopter come in with a guy with an RPG that blows a hole in the roof and then like gets him out of here. So we need to be ready to shoot down a helicopter. It's just like, where are we? It sounds like an active war zone. Really?
Yeah, I mean that's I think that might have been Ridwan Taghi in the
Yes, that's who it
Netherlands, right?
was.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a that is really unbelievably shocking stuff. And he is as Mitch Prothero said, in a high security compound, because he is so seen as so dangerous. But that's something which I think leads to this adjustment. People, I think anyone who thought it wasn't a problem before these things started to happen, I think probably realizes that you can't deal with these complex organized criminal networks in the same way you would deal with like a local gang. Um, but yeah, people were definitely completely shocked by the brazenness. It's really the brazenness of it all. It's as in the podcast, we speak to a lot of law enforcement people who they point out, they're just like, it's not smart if you're a criminal to murder people. It's extremely bad for business. The moment you start killing people and hiring hitmen and having shootouts and stuff like that, law enforcement, the state has to focus on you. There's no excuse for the government to not go after you then. All of these guys in different contexts, be it in Ireland or in the Netherlands or in other countries, they have sort of effectively made a decision where they're like, we don't care. We're not going to get caught. We can do this, and we can be, we're kind of far away. And that was the brazenness of that was pretty shocking. Anyone before who had a sort of business to protect would have not made those same decisions, and that's a sort of generational shift.
Yeah, you would think, and it's a scary one, right? Because it's no longer like, oh, we got to keep things quiet. We don't want to get civilians caught up in this. Now it's just like, go blow up the whole thing that guy's in, and then who cares? Because we're not going to get caught, and we don't give a crap, right? So it's almost like become terrorism in many ways, or like adjacent to terrorism. They might not have political goals, but the reckless disregard for everything around them is kind of scary. And it seems like you can't really clamp down on this with local police resources. You really need like an FBI or a DEA to be like, okay, we're dismantling this, and you need like what was that task force that took down Al Capone, right? The Untouchables. You kind of need like Untouchables to take these guys down, because the reason they came up with that group back in whatever the Al Capone days is because the cops were like, what do you want us to do? They're threatening our families. They're threatening the judges. We can't. And so they were like, all right, we need cops who just don't care and are just going to go after these guys, even if they're going to get killed doing it. And I think that was kind of the story behind that. And you really need you need a task force like that, except it's got to be a hell of a lot larger, because you're not just going after Al Capone. You're going after like Taghi and 18 of his closest competitors in one area. It's just crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it needs to be international. You need to get, that's what they did. They basically they got the Americans involved, they got the DEA involved. There were multiple different law enforcement agencies across Europe sort of working together, increasingly sharing intelligence, and they did manage to get some of these guys. But yeah, that said, some of them are still at large. So and that's with the combined sort of might of all of these governments. Like, I'm like loath to criticize these. I think the law enforcement effort has been, they've done what they can. They've done a very good job in very, very difficult circumstances. It's a very, very, very difficult thing to do. But it is fascinating for me that in this modern age, that you can be a sort of fugitive, or you can have you sanctioned, and you can buy all of the and have all of the attention from all of these governments and the US Treasury and stuff, and you can still be out there. Somehow you have, for a year or so, you've evaded capture. I find that kind of mind-boggling.
I feel like you need nation state resources to do that, though. I'm no expert, but if you're connected to Iran and you're Jordan Harbinger one day, but then tomorrow I'm Mike Johnson, that it's going to be hard to catch me, because I've got a totally legit passport with a fake backstory, a mailing address, property, a bunch of money, and other resources at my disposal, right? So it probably gets a lot easier if you're not just some like fugitive who's got a pocket full of cash who's trying to avoid getting caught. I think facial recognition may change some of this, because change your identity all you want, man. But if you don't have a brand new chin and cheeks and nose and lips and forehead and whatever else and eyes, that stuff's getting harder to fool. You can walk through an airport and you think you're safe, and they're like, oh, our new firmware update makes it so we know that that guy is that drug trafficker who looks totally different, but is definitely him according to the computer. Let's arrest him and take a blood sample. Oh, look, we got this guy who's been on the run for 20 years. Like, that's going to happen at some point.
Yeah, but then I guess also the other thing is, if you've got the backing of a state who's protecting you, you need to ensure that you are still useful to that state.
Right.
Because there'll be a point perhaps when they're just like, do we really care about this guy anymore? And especially if you're on the run, you can't run your criminal operation anymore. You're extremely hot, so you can't talk to people. You can't move money around. You might be extremely rich, but you can't get access to any of that money. And you will eventually run out of money to pay people off or pay your friends in your host country. And then what happens?
Yeah, I agree. I can't imagine living like this. You talk about this guy, Sammy Issa, and he has all these quirks. Like, he never leaves through the same door he went in. And I'm like, imagine every day you have to walk in the front door, you go out the back door, you got to change clothes when you're in there. So you got to bring the clothes with you. It's like you're just light. Your whole life is just stress. You're just worried about getting shot or arrested every second of the day.
Oh, unbelievably so. Yeah. I can't even imagine the amount of discipline it must take and how exhausting that must be. And eventually, how I think anyone would just eventually just get tired and just be like,
Yeah.
I just can't do this anymore. Or
No.
they would be captured or killed. It's wild. Yeah, I mean, that's why, I find these stories when there's these cases and you can get really good insight into the sort of the lives that these people are living. Frequently, a lot of the evidence and stuff I was working with was wiretap and environmental intercept evidence and stuff, which was mixed with like surveillance photos and like phone messages. So you get a really like kind of granular insight into the day-to-day of some of these characters. And you see the paranoia, you see the only time, in the case of the mafia, the mafia guy in the book, Chasing Shadows, he doesn't have anyone really to talk to apart from his girlfriend, his mistress, and the fact he's married. And the only place he talks to her is in her kitchen. So he comes home, she lives in this apartment, he comes home from work, his work, quote unquote, which is drugs trafficking. He comes back, he's like, oh, this guy is such an idiot. He's screwed up this thing with his payment, or he hasn't, booked the right thing for the guy from the cartel. And in that room, there's an environmental intercept. It's just capturing all of these conversations. And so you kind of get a little bit of an insight into the paranoia and eventual desperation, when things go wrong, how claustrophobic that world must be, where you can't do anything.
It would be hard to live well even in a place like Dubai, which doesn't extradite, because now anybody who does business with you, if you're sanctioned, also becomes a criminal. So it's not like you can just find, oh, I'm going to just use a cutout for this. It's like, no, anybody, you're just radioactive. You can't use a branch of a bank that is in another country, because that branch is a subsidiary of another bank that has a location in New York, and they're like, we're not going to get our shit frozen for this yutz. No way. So you're just untouchable unless you have like 2 or 3 really, really good cutouts that are that are very deniable. And that stuff that's got to get expensive. I mean, you got to have people who are like, I'm taking a lot of risk dealing with you. Everything is 50% more expensive. And that means everything is more expensive, because somebody's going to get in real trouble.
Steal your money. I think it's people, you used to have a lot of, let's say, you're a crime boss, you had a lot of money stashed away in various different things. It could be in art in Singapore, it could be in crypto, it could be, properties in Turkey or whatever. The moment you're on the run and the moment you're no longer there to sort of run the day-to-day operations, people will start to steal from you.
Sure.
They'll be like, oh, yeah, he's not going to mind if I just take this thing I'm supposed to be looking after for him, or no one's ever going to know. It's by its nature, hidden wealth. It can't be, it's meant to be obscured. It's not going to be in their name. It might be movable property, So there's a lot of risks in that point when you become sanctioned, you become so hot, you can't do anything anymore. You can't run your organization anymore. And, perhaps, people also stop fearing you as much. and that's
Yeah.
because these people can't retire frequently. One of the things we were talking about, the sort of the brazenness and the brutality of some of the things that they were doing, it sort of reflects a sort of mentality, I think, of there's no exit plan seemingly for these people, because if they were rationally planning an exit, they would not be doing horrific things like ordering murders all across Europe or whatever.
Right.
There's that it kind of reflects a mentality of almost like they just have to ride it through to the end.
Yeah.
Because once they stop, I think that they're multiple, they become vulnerable.
That's a good point. Yeah, I guess it's all just like, I'm gonna die in this game, so I got to do whatever I can to survive until then. And it's just like, but as a normie, I can't get behind that, right? Like I would never do that. Nobody in their right mind would ever do that. And I guess that's why the dream for most organized criminals, right, is to get into legitimate business and then maybe have your kids run that, because you're always going to be a piece of crap who's going to go to jail or die. But like maybe your son can be a guy who owns a manufacturing plant or an import-export business that isn't just going to end up on, with splattered all over the pavement for no good reason. It's just, that's like the dying wish would be to just like maybe have a generational exit, but it's not going to be for you.
Absolutely. I mean, that's in the work I've done on the Calabrian mafia, the 'Ndrangheta, there's it's relatively well known in Italy and amongst the sort of the police in Italy and experts on that stuff that they're the younger generation who've gone to do MBAs. Their fathers are crime bosses and they've been sent to do MBAs, and some of them in pretty prestigious universities. I mean, but then the question is that to go legit, or is it to
Right.
bring those skills into the family business or transform the family business? But then there's also that interesting sort of like classic tale of in the case of the Kinahan cartel, which I'm sure your listeners will know about. The Irish crime family who were sort of very prominent figures in the European cocaine market. They that was a case of a father who built a criminal empire, and and his son, plausibly could have gone legit, and but there was something where he had this sort of clearly he continued in crime and is now sanctioned, but he then at the same time became a boxing promoter, and he was promoting Tyson Fury and became a sort of celebrity almost. And there's this sort of duality, this tension there in a character where you want to be accepted as a public figure and a legitimate person. This is a guy who hired lawyers to threaten journalists to sue them if they had connected him with crime. He would have PR consultants and all this stuff, but at the same time he's running a criminal empire. So and those two things are not going to be able to be compatible for forever. So I think there's a sort of interesting psychological aspect of that, of like why someone, maybe it's just part of their identity, but why if someone had the option of going legitimate, why they wouldn't take that.
Yeah. Boxing, this is an interesting sort of aside, right? Because boxing has always got this little underbelly of like dirty fights, dirty money, underground this, unsanctioned stuff. And they're always trying to move away from that. So when you have an organized criminal who's becoming a big time boxing promoter and getting a lot of attention because essentially he's overpaying for fighters because he's using criminal proceeds allegedly to do that, that makes everybody kind of be like, oh, we worked so hard to get away from this crap. And here's this mafia guy essentially money laundering by overpaying. I think what was he doing? He's like paying his fighters more money than they were actually winning from the fights. So he was essentially going to lose money on every fighter, but it doesn't matter because if you're using that to wash dirty money, you don't care if you lose 10 or 20% on the fighter, right? On the fight or the fighter, because you can afford to do that. It's the cost of doing business. And I guess this got uncovered in a lawsuit because the litigator was a former prosecutor. So he was like, wait a minute, just doing the math here, this looks like money laundering. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for this kid, this Kinahan.
Yeah.
Kid.
I mean, that's the allegations. I mean, at least like in terms of he, what can be said is that this is a guy who was a major criminal figure who very quickly rose to the absolute top of the boxing world. Like to the very pinnacle. He was hanging out with people like Bob Arum, who is a boxing Hall of Fame member, promoted Muhammad Ali. He was promoting Tyson Fury, one of the most famous boxers in the whole world. He was really at the top, so it kind of shows like however he did that, you know, yes, let's say it definitely coincided with the same time he was running a criminal group. But
Yikes.
yeah, it's a fascinating, yeah, it's an interesting spin on as you say, on an old story. It's sort of it's a 21st century kind of version of that story of sort of crime and boxing, which has always had a relationship, and dirty money being involved in boxing, but set in a very different place than Dubai.
Yeah.
But
People are probably wondering why we keep mentioning Dubai, but it does seem like a lot of these weird characters congregate in Dubai. And it's like, I think one of the guys on your podcast was saying, oh, it's like a mix of Manhattan, Beverly Hills, and Miami. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, so Dubai, he says it's like that because Dubai is a place. For people who, I'm sure your listeners know, but for people who don't know, it's part of the United Arab Emirates. It doesn't have, unlike its neighbors, natural resources wealth, and so the entire economy has been based on attracting kind of finance and real estate, and sort of creating a tourist destination. So it has these huge skyscrapers, which make it a bit like Manhattan in that sense. But in terms of its model, it's become, in the 1980s, it was a very different place, but it's sort of grown up into this kind of metropolis, I guess, where there's a lot of luxury. Everything is sort of this bling aspect to it, where they have these quite bizarre, they islands which are shaped, like, and in the shape of a palm, and they have these sort of luxury real estate developments on there, and they attract a lot of money from around the world. And it also attracts, it doesn't have it's well known for not having particularly stringent anti-money laundering concerns, so people bring in money, unexplained wealth from all around the world, and kind of park it in Dubai. And because it has this sort of luxury element to it, it has, Salt Bay's restaurant or whatever. And it has, this like, what's called a 7-star hotel, which doesn't even exist or something. It has
Right.
all of these things. People will come from around the world to be there. And that creates this weird, the way I describe in the podcast, sort of the Star Wars cantina of sort of strange characters in the Middle East, where you'll have like you'll have a soccer player, you'll have a hedge fund manager, you'll have an arms dealer, you'll have a drugs trafficker, you'll have an Instagram influencer, and they're all sort of sitting in the same restaurant taking selfies or whatever. And it's this very bizarre melting pot of this sort of like collision of multiple things, like international and like financial forces.
I've got some friends who work in Dubai in various industries, and in my own group of friends who work in Dubai are also kind of like the Star Wars cantina. It'll be like a hairdresser who went there because the money's better, a masseuse who went there because the money's better, and another person's like, yeah, I'm former CIA, and that's all I'm going to tell you. And you're like, okay. And then there's another person who's like a personal protection specialist, and he's like, yeah, my clients are also the members of what you would call the Star Wars cantina, right? Like a Pakistani scam call center owner, or somebody investigating Chinese gangsters running crypto fraud scams, or Indian mafia guys, or people who can't go back to Afghanistan because of the Taliban, but they're somehow really rich. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't seem legit at all. So you see that, and the expert you had on, man, he had such a good explanation. He said something like, Dubai is the brackish inlet where the salty waters of criminality meet with the fresh water of legitimate business, which sounds like a great recipe for money laundering and pretty much everything else that you normally don't want in your country.
Yeah, I mean that was a fantastic. His name's Matthew Page. He's works in the Carnegie Endowment, and he's a very interesting guy. He used to work for the U.S. government, and now sort of writes about kleptocracy, and so did this fantastic report on Dubai, where and his description, as you said, is perfect. It's this sort of place where dirty money and clean money can kind of come together and just sort of like merge, and no one really asks any questions. And but it's it's very modern. It's a very modern phenomenon. It's something where he said to me something really interesting, I thought, which was sort of about like what he called I guess quite academic way of putting it, but he called it a global elite formation. Where historically if you were someone who was sort of wanted to, you know, like could be a crime boss, you know, or whatever, but someone who had a lot of money and wanted their kids to sort of join the global elite somehow. In the past, maybe, you know, 100 years ago, you might have sent them to, you know, Yale or Oxford or something, and they would have got a degree. And, you know, now there's this sort of weird new style of elite formation where people go to Dubai and places like that and take Instagram selfies of themselves in restaurants, you know, but it's a sort of status is conferred by wealth in a different way in that environment. And it's sort of changing the way which sort of like, yeah, these sort of like status elites, global elite status sort of functions.
Yeah, I've seen, I know a couple of people who track, for example, Iranian Ayatollahs' families' Instagrams. I know this is very niche, but it'll be like, which is ironic because some of the photos that they share, it's like two girls dressed in basically something that looks like dental floss, and they're at a club, and it's like, who's that? Oh, those are the Grand Ayatollah's great granddaughters or granddaughters. And you're like, the ones that look literally like showgirls and are just doing kissy face to the camera with a bottle of champagne. Their grandpa is this super conservative, theocratic authoritarian in Iran. It's like, yeah, really, really shocking. And of course, they're in Dubai.
I haven't seen that. Is that, are they in Dubai when they're partying?
Sometimes
or?
London when they're partying, but sometimes Dubai. And a lot of the Russian oligarchs' kids are in Dubai as well. And there was one sort of famous gaffe where I don't remember whose daughter this was, but she posted something that was like, no war. And it was like, hey, do you know how daddy pays for your villa in the French Alps when you go skiing with your friends, dumbass? He starts wars and sells weapons to countries. So maybe take that post down. She took it down, but people, you know, her photos are all just her, you know, partying all over the world. And it's like, yeah, your daddy's a bad man. Maybe you don't know.
It sounds
that.
like an interesting niche. I wrote a piece last year about Evgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner guy's family, who had sort of we kind of did a bunch of digging on it. And it was interesting because we basically saw that they although he had been sanctioned for quite a long time before the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, his family had basically just been living this life of luxury in Europe. You know, his daughters were like show jumping. So they had this stable of horses, like you know, show ponies or whatever, and they were competing in all these competitions in the Mediterranean and stuff like that. And like, you know, his youngest daughter at the time, like on the eve of the competed in an event in Spain on the eve of the invasion, and then obviously like rushed to Russia. But yeah, it was an interesting insight into how, you know, that's an important point in terms of these sorts of people we're talking about, you know, in terms of like law enforcement action against them or sanctions or whatever, you know, it gets quite complicated with families. You know,
Yeah.
there are you know, there are people who argue that you are not, if someone will say, okay, I might go to jail, but my kids will have millions of dollars, that's a trade I'm worth making, that's worth making for me, you know, you would say, you know, is that then, if you don't seize that wealth somehow, you know, is that just an incentive to kind of commit crime or do whatever? And there are other people who'd say, you know, the families are distinct, you know, there are these legal battles which are going on. You know, Prigozhin's mum, who I think is, last time I checked, 86 or maybe 87, you know, she attempted to overturn the European Union sanctions against her. You know, so she was sanctioned by the European Union. She said, look, he's my son, but I don't have anything to do with him. My son may be the most famous warlord in the whole world, but I don't have anything to do with him. And she did succeed, I think. I can't. Yeah, I think. So it's I think it's a tricky legal issue, and there's a tricky moral issue about what you do about that.
I do feel bad for somebody like that if she's really like, yo, I disowned that guy because he's a terrible person, and now I can't like go grocery shopping. That sucks. But if she's just lying, then well, you know. Screw her.
Yeah,
too,
I mean, we
know.
in that same piece, we looked at that. I mean, she did not appear to have disowned him by any means.
Okay, well then she's just the piece of crap apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Well, I hope she. I'm pretty sure she was. You know, all those people get theirs at some point. Maybe not all, but many. I mean, he got blown up in a plane crash. I'm sure she had a bad day at that point, and now she can't do anything about it either. So who knows? Man, this conversation was all over the place. Super interesting discussion of a lot of complex problems, Miles. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for checking out this entire episode on YouTube. If you want to follow up on this topic, check out our podcast feed or visit us on our website at jordanharbinger.com, where you can learn more about our guest and dive even deeper into what we discussed today. And remember, YouTube is not the only place that you can check out The Jordan Harbinger Show. Any podcast app should have us. Check out the links in the description where you will find access to our shows that don't appear on YouTube, like Skeptical Sunday, where we debunk topics like crystal healing, GMOs, conspiracy theories, homeopathy, tipping, even lawns, to find out if they're backed by science and logic, or if they're just complete nonsense. Spoiler, many of them are complete nonsense. Also, our Feedback Friday shows where we help people escape from cults, get raises at work, and take all manner of questions from you, the audience, all the way down to the bottom of the barrel. And every episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show has something useful you can take away and apply in your own life and help you navigate what I know can often seem like the overwhelming and paralyzing challenges of modern life. Life can be hard, yes, but we are here to help. And if you appreciate how we help, remember to like, comment, and subscribe.